human tradition. It has allowed political authority to be argued about in a way which would have been very difficult in the ancient world. And it has said to the state, in effect, that unless the state has within it some element, some community answerable to more than itself, that state becomes locked into a totalitarian and oppressive mode. The great paradox is, it seems, that Christianity, having said to the state, "You are a secular reality," then also says to the state, "And woe betide you if you think that secular reality is everything, because then you become another kind of sacred monster." In our modern setting, we face not a sacred Roman emperor with incense burning on his altars. We do face a growing tendency in public discourse to imagine that the only kind of voice really credible in the public sphere is a secular one. And Christianity's response to that is not to say every voice in public must be sacred, but to say our history suggests that there is a healthy argument to be had between the sacred and the secular. That public space in a society is not space that has been cleared of all religious illusion or religious authority. It is simply the space where you have the argument. So in this first respect, I would say that those early generations in which the Christian Church formed its identity not only set a long trail of consequences going in the history of Europe, but also opened up perspectives on our current situation and our current cultural standoffs, which are well worth reflecting on. But I want to move on from this to look behind Christianity's early affirmations about itself and the state, to ask what it was in Christian belief that helped to make those possible. Christians believed that they belonged to an assembly, a citizens' assembly independent of the state, because they believed they had been invited freely by God to belong to that community. In other words, they believed that God was free to choose. They believed that God was independent of the political and the material processes of the world, yet capable of engaging with them without being absorbed into them. For the early Christians, God was not a metaphor for cosmic balance, nor was God a sublime intelligence gradually overcoming the resistance of the material world to make something rather tidier than was there in the first place. God was not a supreme mind too exalted to be concerned about particulars. God was indeed wholly independent of the world, and therefore free of any conditioning or pressure or manipulation, and also, for that very reason, free to engage with what was created. It's a fusion of some elements in ancient philosophy, Platonic and Stoic especially. Their appeal to the radically unchallengeable, unchangeable, invulnerable reality behind all appearances, a fusion of that with the dramatic narratives of Jewish scripture, the narratives of a God independent and free and engaged with human history. And that was a very explosive and a very difficult marriage, which came quite near to the divorce courts at several points in the history of Christian theology, and yet somehow has survived those stresses. What it isn't is simply the triumph of classical philosophy over the Bible, as some textbooks will still tell you. It's a bold and extremely risky attempt, this Christian view of God, to hold together a conviction about the absolute and unchangeable with a conviction about the primacy of liberty and of love. Love which, because it is free, is capable of engaging with what is completely different from itself. There's a fascinating and very suggestive passage in the writings of one 2nd century Christian thinker who says, we frequently imagine love in terms that are really about love for what's like us. Love is natural sympathy. And yet when we think about God, he goes on, we have to imagine a love that has nothing to do with natural sympathy, because we're not like God. God is as different from the world as could be, and yet God is engaged with us in love. Therefore, the way in which we as human beings try to live out our love has to be in terms of an attitude to the stranger and the other that is not based on natural sympathy and easy affinity. In that explosive and difficult marriage, as I've called it, of philosophy and the Bible, two of the most characteristic doctrines of Christianity began to take shape. The doctrine of the Trinity, that God's love and freedom are eternally exercised, never mind the world, in some kind of mutual flow of giving and receiving, for which we use the powerful, unavoidable, but still questionable language of personal relationship. And second is the doctrine of creation. The world exists because God decided it would, not because he had to make it, because he felt lonely, because he needed the world to complete his own being, because he found unformed matter lying around and thought it would be a good idea to make something nicer. What is around us is because the God of eternal, free love has elected that there should be a world. And having made a world out of that causeless love, he has no reason to stop loving it. I've called it an explosive and a difficult mixture. So it is. But it remains, in a more contemporary context, a distinctive and difficult set of doctrines. It means that in the modern world of spiritualities, Christians still want to position themselves over against certain views of the sacred or the holy. They want to position themselves over against an impersonal view of the divine, that the divine is just a name for the totality of order and meaning in the universe. No, the Christian would say, God is beyond that and free of that. God is not another name for any aspect of the universe we know. Yet Christianity would also want to position itself against a religious sensibility which thinks of God simply as a hugely inflated version of the human ego. So much about the human ego is not about either liberty or love, And so if we try to think of God in something like personal terms, we have the great challenge of thinking away what we mean by selfhood. So, within a world of competing spiritualities, Christianity seeks to hold together certain perspectives that other philosophies, spiritualities, and religious traditions, in various ways, want to hold apart. Christianity remains committed to the absoluteness of God. God is not an item in any list, a member of any series. And yet, the only way we can satisfactorily find of talking about God is in terms of what we have to regard as personal qualities, such as love. But one further consequence of this is worth mentioning at this point. God has made a world out of his absolute liberty, we say. But God is not simply absolute liberty. God is absolute consistency. God's unchangeable nature means that what he does coherently, without being diverted, which is one of the foundations for regarding the world itself as making coherent sense. Now, this wasn't a discovery of early Christianity. There was, as we all know, such a thing as ancient Greek science. What Christianity did, though, was to provide a concept of a world that was both limited and consistent. And without that philosophical structure, it's very difficult to give a rational account of science. Which is why we come to our second paradox of the evening. If Christianity is in large part responsible for secularism, it may turn out that Christianity is also, in some degree, responsible for science. That's to say, it introduces into the intellectual world a notion of that bounded and consistent reality with which the scientist seeks to engage. It sets out the foundation for that extraordinary act of faith which every scientist, practical or theoretical, still makes. The act of faith that what is true today will be true tomorrow. But let me, thirdly, return to the question of divine love. I've mentioned the 3rd century writer who insists that divine love doesn't depend on affinity. And one of the consequences that is drawn from that in early Christian thinking is that God is quite capable of loving material stuff. Over against a number of religious and philosophical options on the market in those days, which would have insisted that divine meaning and material stuff had to be completely opposite, Christianity, with some difficulty and lots of ambiguity, hung on, sometimes by its fingernails, to the idea that the material world was not empty of meaning. Some of the greatest and bitterest struggles in the early church were over those systems which insisted that the material world had to be a mistake, the result of some inept or malicious heavenly being who was either out to complicate matters or simply incompetent. Christianity insisted that God revealed divine meaning in material form, in the history of material beings, including, of course, material beings like you and me.